Good morning, church family. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Sunday morning Bible class at the Broad Street Church of Christ. For the last 3 or so months, we've been seeking to answer the question, does archaeology support the Bible? Last week, we finished our discussions of the biblical city of Damascus, and this week we will begin with a brief discussion of the impact that Abraham's rescue of his nephew Lot may have had on the politics of Mesopotamia. As I walked into the building, someone asked me, are you going to talk about ancient history today? And I'm going to start off talking about ancient history today. After that, we will move on to the Valley of Kings and the rest of Genesis chapter 14. These were the verses where we left off last week. I will reread them to refresh our memories. And they're talking about Abraham here in verse 14. And went in pursuit as far as Dan. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobo, north of Damascus. Genesis chapter 14, verse 15 tells us that Abraham routed the armies of the Mesopotamian kings. Verse 16 states that he recovered all goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possession, together with the women and the other people. The Bible doesn't state whether Abraham and his men killed any of the 4 kings, but if those kings survived, they went home empty-handed. So it would be interesting to look to see if there was any kind of historical or political unrest that went on in the Middle East at or shortly after this time frame. So let's look at the kingdom of Elam first. During this time frame, the kingdom of Elam was in a period of political transition, with one dynasty ceding control to another dynasty shortly after these events. So did Chedorlaomer get killed? Or did he return to Elam just to lose the faith of his people and get deposed? I guess we won't know for sure. Now let's look at Sumer. During this time frame, Sumer was a politically unstable region dominated by the Amorite-ruled city-state of Larsa. The period just before the raid into Canaan marked the apex of Larsa's power. Within a few decades, Larsa will lose control of Sumer to the rising Babylonian Empire. Which brings us to Babylon. Just prior to the raid into Canaan, Babylon was a minor town or city-state holding very little territory. The rulers of Babylon were held in vassalage to the king of Elam. Shortly after the raid into Canaan, the Amorites seized power over the city-town of Babylon, and within a few decades, the Amorite king Hammurabi unified much of Mesopotamia, establishing a powerful Babylonian empire. So there's a turnover of rulers there in Babylon. And what about Assyria? In the decades before the raid into Canaan, Assyria had reached its peak under the leadership of Sargon I. His successor and son, Puzar-Ashur II, ruled until about the time of this raid. How he died is unrecorded. It's not clear that he was one of the kings that participated in the raid on Canaan. He was succeeded by his son, Dameron-Sin, around the time frame of the raid into Canaan. So to summarize, it's not clear what impact Abram's rescue of Lot had on the politics of Middle East. Abram's successful rescue of his nephew Lot may have had an historical impact on the kingdoms of the East. It may have destabilized the kingdoms, leading to power struggles, and that changed history. Any questions on that before I move on?
You have any idea of the size of the army? I keep
So the Bible's not clear on how large the armies of the Mesopotamian kings were. It does mention that Abraham had 319 trained men, and then he had his friends from, who were Amorites, from Hebron, who came with him. So you're right, there was he had a small force compared to what was most likely a much larger force. The force was large enough that they were easily able to overcome the 5 kings of the plains. And they successfully raided 6 cities before they got there. So it was a sizable army, but we don't know how big. From a military perspective, I believe he routed them at the city of Dan because A, they weren't expecting anyone to follow him. B, he did it at night. And the city of Dan, at the time of Abraham, only had 1 gate. So he probably was able to rout him because A, it was a surprise attack and it was at night, and there was only 1 way in and out. And it says he routed them, so that doesn't mean that he conquered them. In fact, he had to chase them in a pursuit all the way past Damascus to Hobah, wherever that is. What was the point I was going to make? From a military perspective, the time of the greatest casualties is during a pursuit phase. When you're pursuing a fleeing army, you kill more of them during that phase than any other phase. The fact that they ran from Dan suggests that they weren't ready, and Abram had the bigger hand, even though he had the smaller force. Any other questions? Okay. So this concludes our discussions on verses 14 through 16. Now we'll move on to verse 17. After Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the King's Valley. So there appears to be 2 place names for the same place here. We have the Valley of Shaveh, or the Shaveh Valley, and we have the King's Valley, both referring to the same place. Now, I know just enough Hebrew to be dangerous, and I've known for quite some time that the word Shaveh means valley. So for me, for several years now, and I was too lazy to go investigate this, I was always curious about why the Valley of Valleys, or the Valley of the Plain. It didn't really make sense to me. So in preparation for this class, I thought there must be some problem in the translation. So in preparation for this class, I went back to the Hebrew to see if I can get any clues as to what the correct translation should be for this passage. And what I found is that the Shaveh used in this passage here is not a normal noun, but a proper name, which means that the Shaveh Valley is a correct translation. The word Shaveh as a noun is used several times in the Bible, in the Old Testament, to refer to various valleys in the Middle East. But the proper name of Shaveh is only used once in the Old Testament, and that's right here in this verse. So Shaveh Valley, or Valley of Shaveh, is a correct translation. The other Hebrew word translated to valley in this passage is Amek, and it's used 10 times in the Old Testament, and the NIV translates it to valley in every case. The term King's Valley is used twice in the Bible, once here in Genesis 14, and once again in 2 Samuel 18:18. There the Bible tells us that Absalom, King David's rebellious son, erected a monument to himself in the King's Valley because he had no son to carry on his memory. The Shaveh Valley, or the King's Valley, is believed to be the Kidron Valley of today, which lies between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. So this is a map. It's the only topographical map I could find of the Kidron Valley. Want to point out a few things. So this is the city of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. This is the Mount of Olives. And this valley here in between is the Kidron Valley, or the Shaveh Valley, or the King's Valley. So in Genesis 14:17, it's known as the Shaveh Valley and the King's Valley. In 2 Samuel 18:18, it's called the King's Valley. However, in Joel chapter 3, it is twice called Jehoshaphat's Valley. So we've got plenty of names for this valley. I mentioned that Absalom, the king of the son of the King David, his rebellious son, erected a monument to himself in this valley. There it is, called Absalom's Monument. And this is a photo of what some people today call Absalom's Monument. It is also called by some as Absalom's Tomb. This structure was carved out of rock on the Mount of Olives side of the Kidron Valley, and you can see the Mount of Olives in the background. Normally, when I show you a picture of something with a name on it, I tell you, this is it, and here's all the reasons why this is the spot. I'm not going to do that today for this spot. This monument is not what it claims to be, or what some people claim it to be. There are a couple of facts that you need to know about this monument. First, in 2 Samuel chapter 18, that verse tells us that Absalom was killed in battle in the forest of Ephraim, which would be located roughly 12 to 15 miles north of Jerusalem. Verse 17 states that his body was thrown into a big pit in the forest, and a pile of rocks was thrown over him. So this monument is certainly not Absalom's tomb. Secondly, archaeologists date this structure to the 1st century AD, not at the time of David. It is designed in the traditional Greek and Roman architecture, which did not exist at the time of King David and Absalom. In addition, there's an inscription inside the structure that reads, "The tomb of Simeon, a very just man, and a devoted elder, and who was waiting for the consolation of the people." And this phrase appears to be about the Simeon that is described in Luke chapter 2, verse 25. Therefore, this structure is not the monument Absalom erected during the United Monarchy period. Any questions there? So if you ever take a tour of Jerusalem and someone wants you to go see Absalom Monument, it's a pretty place, looks nice, but it's not. It's not the monument he built, and it's not his tomb. So, after several weeks in Genesis chapter 14, we are going to fast forward to Genesis chapter 20. There are no place names in chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 that we haven't already discussed. So we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 20. But before I do, I want to summarize the events that occurred in each chapter so that we can keep track of what's going on in Abram's life, so that when we get to chapter 20, we're all on the same sheet of music. In chapter 15, God reaffirms his covenant with Abraham. After Abraham reminds God that he has no heirs to inherit the land, God informs Abraham that his descendants will be numbered like the stars at night. But God also states that his descendants would not inherit the land for several generations. In chapter 16, Abram, still at this point, encouraged by his wife Sarai, sleeps with Sarai's Egyptian slave Hagar and makes her pregnant. The Bible states that Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years at the time that he made her pregnant, and since he entered into Canaan at age 75, he would now be 85 at the time that he made her pregnant. Hagar begins to despise Sarai. Sarai mistreats Hagar and Hagar runs into the desert. Hagar runs into an angel of the Lord who encourages her to return to Sarai and to name her unborn child Ishmael. At the end of the chapter, Hagar bears Abram a son named Ishmael, and Abram is now 86 years old. Chapter 17 begins 13 years after the end of chapter 16, with Abram turning 99 years old. God changes Abram's name to Abraham, which in Hebrew means father to many. God requests that Abraham and all his male descendants and all males in the household undergo circumcision as a sign of the covenant, and Abraham and his household obey. God also changes Sarai's name to Sarah, and he reaffirms that Sarah will bear Abram a son named Isaac within the year. Chapter 18 begins with Abraham still at Mamre near Hebron. 3 men approach near his tent. Abraham recognizes that these men are angels from God. He urges them to stay for a while. Abraham provides a meal. The angel of the Lord tells Abraham that Sarah will bear Abraham a son within the year. Sarah laughs and then is admonished by the angel. The angels get up to go towards Sodom. God tells Abram of his plan to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham then pleads for the 2 cities. The angels leave for the cities, and Abraham at this point returns to his tent. In chapter 19, Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, but not before Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters are allowed to escape to the small town of Bela, which is later named Zorah. The angels warn Lot not to look back, but his wife did look back, and she was turned into a pillar of salt before she reached Bela. The next morning, Abraham saw the smoke rising from Sodom and Gomorrah from the mountains west of Hebron. Lot and his daughters left Zoar to live in a cave in the mountains. The daughters schemed to get Lot drunk so that he would make them pregnant. The older daughter gave birth to Moab, who became the ancestors of the Moabites, who settled in the mountains where Lot's cave existed. The younger daughter gives birth to Ben-Ami, who becomes the ancestor of the Ammonites. The Ammonites settle in the region just north of the Moabites. And I've got a map here. This was the best map I could come up with that showed both Moab and Ammon. Looks like it's a little hard to read, probably because of the yellow. I want to point out Jerusalem is right here, and Jericho is right here. This is the Jordan. This is the Dead Sea. It's listed as Salt Sea here. The Valley of Siddim that we talk so much about is currently underwater at this point, under the south basin of the Dead Sea. Hebron, where Abram is located right here. So he can get on the mountains and he can see the damage. This is Sodom here. Gomorrah is here. Zoar or Bela is right here. And the cave where Lot and his daughter stayed would be right about here. This is Moab. This is where the descendants of Lot's oldest daughter, Moab, eventually, by the time of the Israeli conquest, they owned this entire lot of land here. And the son, Ben-Ami, of the younger daughter, ancestor of the Ammonites, and this is where they settled. Both Moab and Ammon are in the modern-day country of Jordan. Any questions there before we move on? Okay, so now we've reached chapter 20. Sodom and Gomorrah have been destroyed, and Abraham at this point, is ready for a change. This is verse 1. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar. The there in the red passage is Mamre, near Hebron, according to the previous chapter. We discussed a few weeks ago that the Hebrew word Negev means south or in a southerly direction. At the time Moses wrote Genesis, there wasn't a region called the Negev, so Moses intended this passage to mean that Abram moved south from Hebron. We discussed a few weeks ago that at the time of Abraham, Kadesh was an outpost or oasis located near the modern-day Israeli-Egyptian border, which is south of Hebron. We discussed in week 2, that the wilderness of Shur is the land area in the northwestern region of the Sinai Peninsula near the Mediterranean Sea. So that leaves us with Gerar as a place name, and I have a map on the next page. This is a satellite map of basically the border between Israel and Egypt. And I'd like to point out the city of Hebron, which is up here. This is Beersheba, which I don't think we're going to talk about today, but we'll talk about next week. This is Kadesh, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. This area here is the wilderness of Shur. It goes all the way to the Suez Canal. So when Genesis tells us that Abram settled between Kadesh and Shur, they're telling us that he settled in this region right here. But it also says he spent some time in Gerar. And Gerar is a Philistine city located right there. Any questions about the map? The city of Gerar is known to archaeologists as Tel Harar in Hebrew or as Tel Abu Harara in Arabic. This site is located 19 miles northwest of Beersheba, 12 miles southeast of the city of Gaza. I didn't point Gaza out because it's not on a map, but Gaza is right along the shore, about right here. And about 12 miles due east of the Mediterranean Sea. It's situated on the north bank of the Wadi Gerar, so it has, or at least it had at the time of Abram, a fresh supply of water. Any questions? Okay, so let's discuss the biblical history of Gerar before we talk about the archaeological history. The city of Gerar is mentioned 10 times in the Old Testament. It is first mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, verse 19, excuse me, as part of the southwestern border of Canaan after the flood and before the time of Abraham. So it was a Canaanite city at that point. Excuse me. Gerar is mentioned twice in Genesis chapter 20 in reference to Abraham's move south and his dealings with Abimelech, the king of the Philistines in Gerar. And while we're here, by the way, Abimelech in Hebrew means my father is king. It's a title and it's not a name. It's like Pharaoh in Egypt. So the fact that it appears during several successive generations in the Bible to refer to the ruler of Gerar is to be expected. Gerar is mentioned 5 times in Genesis chapter 26 in reference to Isaac and Abimelech of the Philistines at Gerar. Gerar is mentioned twice in 2 Chronicles chapter 14 during the time of King Asa of Judah, which is roughly 912 to 870 BC, and the divided monarchy. At that time, Gerar and the surrounding villages were occupied by an invaded Cushite army from south of Egypt. So now that we've established the biblical history, let's look at the archaeological digs or explorations that have occurred at Gerar or Tel Harar. In 1924, American archaeologist William F. Albright conducted a survey, not an excavation, of Tel Harar and saw evidence of a Cushite colony dating to the 9th century BC, or the time frame of King Asa of Judah. In 1956, Israeli archaeologist Yohanan Aharoni conducted a survey, again not excavations, of Tel Harar, and proposed that the site was the biblical city of Gerar. His proposal was based on his own examinations of Middle Bronze Age construction and pottery consistent with Genesis, as well as Albright's claim of a 9th century Cushite colony consistent with 2 Chronicles. Between 1982 and 1988, Israeli archaeologist Elazar Oren of the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev conducted yearly excavations at Tel Harar. Dr. Oren agreed with Aharoni's proposal that Tel Harar is the biblical city of Gerar. In 2010, Dr. Oren returned to Tel Harar with two other archaeologists, P. Nashoni and G. Bar-Oz, for one additional season of excavations. This is an aerial view of the Nahal Gerar Archaeological Park, which was taken in June of 2016. Nahal Gerar refers to the river or stream at the bottom and the right side of the picture. This is a small stream. That's the Nahal Gerar. The boundaries of the park is roughly the white roads that you see on the photo. These are roads here. And so that's the park. Actually, the park does start here, dips down into here, and then comes up like that. The Tel, or the old ancient city, is this area right in here. And I've got a picture on the next slide of just the Tel. This is a site map drawn by Elazar Oren of Tel Harar. It consists of an upper city at the top here and a lower city here. The upper city is roughly in the shape of a diamond with the edges about 300 feet long, each edge. The outer city walls were first fortified with dirt ramparts. Later, the earthworks were replaced with massive brick walls. A ritual temple was found here at Site K, and evidence of animal sacrifices were found at the temple. An ancient well is located here, and it dates back to the time of Abraham, and it's believed to be one of the wells that Abraham dug that is mentioned in Genesis chapter 26. Any questions on the site map? Okay. So now let's compare the biblical history and the archaeological findings at Tel Harar, the biblical city of Gerar. So this slide is a comparison of the two. The Bible, in Genesis chapter 10, lists Gerar as part of the table of nations that arose from Noah's son Ham. Gerar is mentioned as a city on the southwestern border of the territory of Canaan. This indicates that the city existed and was occupied by the Canaanites after the flood and before the time of Abraham. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 23 tells us that the region was initially occupied by the Avites, a subtribe of the Canaanites, but they were driven out by the Caphtorites from Caphtor. Most English Bibles tells us that Caphtor is what we call the island of Crete today. Jeremiah chapter 47, verse 4, and Amos chapter 9, verse 7 tells us that the Philistines came from Caphtor. So the Caphtorites in Deuteronomy are the same as the Philistines in Genesis. Any questions there? Okay. That has been a huge sticking point amongst historians, because the historians believed up until recently that there were no Philistines in Israel at the time of Abraham. The Bible clearly says that there were, and we're about to find out that there is evidence that they were there. Archaeologists tells us that the earliest evidence of human habitation at Tel Harar dates back to 4500 to 3500 BC, when a small village in what later becomes the lower city was established on the site. The village was likely part of a larger network of settlements that developed in the region during this time. Pottery and a chalice originating from Crete, dating from this time period, has been found at Tel Harar. This is consistent with a Philistine present at Tel Harar during the time of Abraham. The Bible in Genesis chapter 20 and 26 tell us that Gerar was occupied by the Philistines at the time of Abraham and Isaac. Archaeology tells us that during the Bronze Age, at the time of Abraham and Isaac, Tel Harar reached its peak and grew into a significant urban center. The lower city expanded to about 38 acres. The city was surrounded by a massive wall and contained a palace, temples, and other public buildings. This was the largest Middle Bronze Age city in southern Canaan. An ancient well, 10 feet in diameter, was also dated to this time frame. This well may be one of the wells dug by Abraham or Isaac, mentioned in Genesis chapters 20 and 26. The city appears to have been abandoned but not destroyed around 1600 BC and remained abandoned for a few centuries. And this probably occurred as a result of the yearly military raids into Canaan started by the Egyptian pharaoh Ahmose I in 1570 BC and continued with his successor. The Bible is silent about the occupation of Gerar during the Israeli conquest area. Archaeology tells us that a small village centered around the southeast section of the former lower city existed during the time frame of the Israeli conquest. Pottery found at this location indicates that the occupiers were Philistines. The Bible is silent about the occupation of Gerar during the time frame of King Saul, David, and Solomon. Excuse me. Excuse me. Archaeology tells us that a small village centered around the northwest section excuse me. centered around the northwest section near the upper city, existed during the time frame of the United Monarchy. This small settlement may have been a fortress. Ceramics found at this location indicate that the occupiers were Philistines. The Bible in 2 Chronicles chapter 14 tells us that the region around Gerar was occupied by Zerah, the leader of the Cushite army. King Asa of Judah drove out the Cushite army and plundered all of the villages around Gerar. Archaeology tells us that the Cushites were present at Gerar during this time frame. In addition, the Tanis stele and the Bubastis stele depict pharaohs during this time frame deploying Cushite armies in Canaan. The exact identity of Zerah is not known. So in summary, archaeology supports all of the Bible's claims about Gerar. While staying in Gerar, Abraham again tells the people that Sarah is his sister, just as he had done in Egypt earlier in Genesis 12. Again, the ruler, this time Abimelech, the Philistine, sent for Sarah and took her. Again, God punished the ruler for this action. Again, God came to Abimelech in a dream. Again, Abimelech lets Sarah go and blesses Abraham with sheep, cattle, slaves, and he gave Sarah about 25 pounds of silver. He also sent Abraham away to live anywhere on the land that he liked. And that concludes chapter 20, and that's where we're going to stop for today. Any questions? No questions. Okay. Next week, we will talk about the place called Beersheba.